Hello and welcome to the Hope at Work podcast. With me today is Mimi Nicklin, who is apparently the world's empathy authority. I have to talk about how you got that title, Mimi, because that's a new one for me. But I have to tell everybody how you wound up on this show. So I actually asked ChatGPT, who should I have on the Hope at Work podcast? And Mimi's name came up first. And it's so crazy that I actually reached out to you and I told you that and you responded. I'm so grateful for you doing so.
Oh, me too, Marcus. What better way to start my day? I suspect you're ending yours because of our time zones. But yes, I always feel really proud that a machine recommended me somehow. I think, well, if ChatGPT said so, we must be destined, right, to be friends forever. But I'm really pleased because there is definitely a lot of crossover between hope and, well, I'm a very hopeful, optimistic person when it comes to reconnecting our world. So, yeah, that's excellent.
I think so too. When I learned about you from my friend ChatGPT, I immediately was like, okay, first of all, she has a book called Empathy at Work, right? So that immediately was a connection. And I know you've got a couple of other books coming out too. Apparently you're a voracious writer. But why don't we start with how in the world did you get into this space? I don't imagine that when you were a child you were like, I want to be the world's empathy authority.
No, I definitely didn't. It's a funny story actually. I mean, I think now, and I've been doing this work now for about 6 years. I'm very sure, Marcus, that I was always meant to do this work. You know, this is where my whole life was kind of leading me. But of course, I had no idea of that in the beginning. And that's quite a new realization. I think I've come to that realization maybe in the last 6 months. But about 6 years ago, I took a CEO role in the Middle East, in Dubai, actually, and I moved my life across the world to take on this job. It was a very large American business, so very well-known, established business. But this was about a 40-person team of that business, a regional unit. And when I got there to the region, let's just say the business wasn't quite as it had been explained to me. We'll leave it at that.
It never is.
It never is. But in this case, I was very overwhelmed, I think, because I had come from very corporate roles. And this new role demanded me to be very entrepreneurial. It was a small team. It was very kind of isolated. The global business and global structure, quite frankly, wasn't that interested in the region at the time. And I remember thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I went to see a business coach to try and understand not only, you know, the leadership I would need to work through these challenges, but also the region at large, because it was very different from where I'd come from. I'd come from Asia. There was a lot of cultural shifts going on. And in that session, Marcus, she was asking me about my leadership style. And I remember she asked me a question which, you know, in the end changed my life, because I had been talking about intuition, being an intuitive leader. And she stopped me and she said, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And at the time, I remember thinking, well, no, it's not empathy. You know, what's empathy got to do with anything? But I did then go away and start looking into and studying empathy. I discovered something called the empathy deficit, which we can talk about if you want. And it changed my life because I felt that once I had discovered this, I kind of was looking around thinking, why is no one talking about this? And if they're not, I will. And so I did.
I love that. Okay. That is amazing. And you know what? I think, again, you and I are very similar. I noticed that not a lot of people were talking about hope, especially in the workplace. And I thought, well, then I'm going to talk about it. So I think we came at this in similar ways. You mentioned the empathy deficit. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the empathy deficit's actually a term coined by Barack Obama in 2006, so long before he was the president. And he was delivering a speech in Washington. And he said to his audience, I know I'm here today to talk about our federal deficit, but I think we should be talking about our empathy deficit. And what he was talking about was the impact of disconnection, a disconnected America, disconnected societies, on future economic growth. So federal and fiscal success, basically, for the country, right? He was saying if we do not reconnect our societies, we cannot succeed to our highest potential. Now, I'm not American, nor am I in America, but my assumption is that he's accurate, not just in the United States, in the world at large, right? In that today, we are the most disconnected we have ever been. And that empathy deficit fundamentally talks to our inability to understand each other, whether that's age, race, religion, color, creed, background, belief, faith, you name it, things that pull us apart. And that's what he was referencing. He was saying, if we don't start to understand the team I'm working with, the people I have to lead, my family, my children, my wife, it doesn't matter, right? We cannot thrive. In fact, as humans, we can't actually survive when we're isolated. So that's where that term came from. And I think, as I said, it has become us. We are now living in a time where there's 52% of the world are lonely. 335 million of us, Marcus, say that we don't have a single friend. 335 million people. So we are our most lonely and probably most hopeless in history. So you and I have work to do.
You apparently do. Well, let's get started. Wow. Okay. So let me ask you a quick question, Mimi. So you mentioned that you relocated to Dubai, but you said you were more accustomed to living in Asia. Where
Yes.
are you from?
Yeah, good question. I'm actually British, so I'm from England, but I have been in this region, so let's say Middle East, Asia, Africa, that whole side of the world, for nearly 20 years. My career was originally in marketing, actually, in advertising and marketing. And I remember I came to Asia very early on. I was about 4 years into my career. And when that stint, it was about 3 years, the first one finished, I couldn't think of any reason where I would go back to the developed world. I just felt that there was so much happening, right, over here in the East. And that led me to a journey that has seen me here for nearly 20 years. Today, I do a huge amount of work in the States. And it puts me in a really good position, I feel, Marcus, because the States is made up of so many cultures, so many microcultures. And when you are able to live around the world, I've worked in 25 countries, especially when you work in work that I do, which is fundamentally about understanding people, cultural differences, beliefs, customs, all kinds of things. I can talk about it, people can ask me questions. Even yesterday, strangely, I did a podcast about grief, and the conversation led to, I hadn't planned it, but it led to me talking about the difference in how we grieve in the East and the West, right? Which would be very similar context to when you talk about hope, how people find hope in the East versus the West. You can see very big differences around the world. So yes, this journey has definitely allowed me to study humanity at its kind of widest lens, really.
Wow. Okay. So much to unpack there. A couple things. First of all, I did actually live a few years in London. So I spent 2 years in London and a year in Edinburgh. So I'm familiar with that part of the world. While I was there, you'll be interested to hear, I went back to school. I went to the University of Sussex. They had a postgraduate certificate program on the psychology of kindness and well-being at work.
Oh, I love that. I would have studied that. Amazing. Yeah. When was that, Marcus? How long ago?
It was 2023. So there's just the tail end of the pandemic. But it was amazing. But so interesting to hear you describe, your experience. First of all, you mentioned grief. I literally just did another podcast with someone talking about layoffs, and they were highlighting for me the fact that is like basically going through the grieving process. And grief is something that I have a personal interest in. I'm actually a facilitator for Grief Share, which is an organization that helps people through the process. So interesting to see all of these parallels come out. But you've got, no doubt, a really interesting point of view about empathy when it comes to cultural nuances. Let me ask you a question. I got two questions for you. first of all, I want to know how you define empathy in the context of work. I think that's important. Secondly, do you think it's defined differently in different parts of the world? Do they prioritize it differently? Do they see it differently?
Mm. So, I mean, excellent questions. How I define it very simply, empathy is a skill set, and it is the ability to take the perspective of somebody else. People get very confused about what empathy is, particularly when it comes to the workplace. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is the ability for you to understand your team or your employees. And Marcus, I always say to people, how are you going to motivate anyone if you don't know what motivates them, right? The assumption of that, so any assumption, is fundamentally the blocker of all performance. And most of the time, in most businesses around the world, we are living in assumption. I think they want a pay rise. I think they want this. I think the client would like that. Well, have you asked them? Fundamentally, empathy is the skill set to be able to take the perspective of somebody else, to see the world through their eyes. Perhaps you're in a negotiation with a client and they're saying, listen, we're not going to renew this contract this year. And when you say why, they're like, well, the fees went up by 5%. Nobody cares about the fees and the 5%, right? What is really changing their mind about your relationship or your contract? Is it really the money? Is it something else in the relationship? Perhaps it's the account manager they're working with, right? So that is what empathy is in the workplace, and it is a skill set. And at least from my point of view, it really is the skill set of our times, because work has never been this complicated in history. Leadership has never been this difficult at any other point in history. And the human data to understand the people you're leading and working with is the point of difference when it comes to your competitive edge. So does that make sense before I move on to your second question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. And then I love your second question because it's very much around kind of culture. What I would say is that in the world, roughly, we have very kind of pro-social, community-driven countries, more community-led, and then very individualistic societies, which you tend to find in the West. So Europe, America, Australia tend to be far more individualistic. In that way, you do see empathic or empathetic differences, because in the East, where I live, and Africa, and much of the Middle East, empathy is far more a lived reality because they live more in community. So I live in Malaysia. Let me give you a reference for point. In the working day in Malaysia, when it gets to lunch, no one is sitting at their desk eating a sandwich whilst doing their emails, right? That is not happening at lunchtime in Malaysia, but it is like this. I've lived all over Asia. It's like this all over Asia, perhaps with the exception of China. People leave their desk and sit in very big groups normally and eat together for 1 hour, right? And that hour, of course, is about the food, but it's about conversation, it's about connection, it's about being together, and then they go back to work, right? They are in community. They are learning, they are listening, and they are interested in each other, versus, of course, many of our realities in the West, which do see us grab a Tupperware or grab a sandwich and sit at our desk and stay in our little world and then carry on through our working days. So the biggest shift that you do see around the world is not necessarily in the definition of empathy, but it is in how it is lived. It is a practice, like any skill set, right? The more you practice it, the better you become at it. Mm-hmm. So in these far more pro-social kind of collectivist societies, you see higher levels of natural empathy. In the Western markets, you're going to see that decline on a far faster trajectory, as it were.
Yeah, I definitely saw that when I spent the brief amount of time I did living in the UK and then traveling to other countries. That's very helpful to understand. So, okay, you mentioned earlier people are lonely, which is funny because I bet you there are people out there that are like, Amy, why are you talking about loneliness in the context of the workplace? That's not a real thing, but I think it is. So Martin Seligman, maybe you're familiar with him, right?
I know the name, yes.
Positive psychologist, came up with the concept of PERMA, right? Okay. Which stands for positive emotions, engagement, which is like flow when you're so into something, like 3 hours passed. But the R in PERMA is relationships. And this is one of the most important fundamental things that people want in the workplace is to have authentic human relationships. Maybe talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of why are we so lonely at work and how do we change that?
Yeah, why are we so lonely? I mean, it is such a huge, huge problem. And I think that now this conversation is coming to the fore. So I think even just 2 years ago, Marcus, when I would talk about this, people really would say, why are you talking about loneliness? But today I get invited into all kinds of shows and media to talk about loneliness because it is suddenly very recognized. The Surgeon General in the USA last year came out and said that to be chronically lonely, so to be lonely long term, is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
The highest burden to our healthcare system is no longer heart disease, diabetes, cancer. It's loneliness. So our loneliness is quite literally killing us. So why is it so important? Because you can't actually survive very well alone. You will die statistically 8 years earlier than your friend that has friends if you're all alone. Because we are a pro-social species. We need to be together to survive, but not just thrive. Which is why in those psychological circles, this communication has started, or this message has started to rise. Fundamentally, what they're saying is, if you are alone, if you are isolated, if you are lonely, you feel that nobody notices you, nobody really cares, maybe you just don't fit in. What that message says to your brain subconsciously from an evolutionary point of view is that you are at risk. Because when we were tribes, men and women, we knew that if we were isolated from the group, from our tribe, either we died, probably, or they did, depending on whether you were the hunter or the gatherer, right? So to be isolated, to be alone, actually sends those signals to the brain, to the body, to say, you're going to die, you're going to die, you're going to die. That's what your brain thinks, right? Which is why it is such an uncomfortable reality. When you feel very alone at a party, maybe you can imagine you go to a networking drinks or something, and you're standing in the corner with your glass of wine, and you're thinking, I don't know who I'm going to talk to. Like, nobody feels like me. Maybe you're shaking. Maybe you have butterflies. Maybe you feel a bit nauseous. They are physiological responses to being alone. So when you put that into the workplace, and we have so many people that feel isolated and alone in the workplace, of course they're not doing their best performance because their brain is too busy trying to keep them alive.
That's right.
So when they're in that state, the blood, the energy in the brain is not pumping into the strategic, the prefrontal cortex part of the brain to solve problems and collaborate and innovate, right? The brain is far more worried about returning you to sort of status quo, to keeping you well. So it's a huge issue, and it's not only physically very dangerous for us, but of course it doesn't do anything for our performance either.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So there's a neurological element that makes loneliness lethal.
Absolutely. Neurological, physiological, and of course emotional, because it feels rubbish too. And all of that leads us to not being able to grow our workplaces. So this is not like a nice thing, like, oh, it would be nice to, right? This is a fundamental. If we continue to allow this to carry on, the low engagement, the demotivation, the low morale, because people don't feel connected, they don't feel seen, they don't think you care, your business won't grow. That's just the end of that, really. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go down that path for a minute. So you talked about, first of all, that when you brought up loneliness initially, people were like, what? And I imagine when you first started talking about empathy, people were like, oh, okay, hold on. That's like this soft stuff. Because it happens to me, too, when I talk about hope. They think, oh, okay. And they almost associate it with weakness, right? So how are you going about changing leaders' minds that this is really important? This is not a nice to have. It is fundamental and foundational for everything else.
Look, I think it's a mix of a couple of things. First of all, it's about consistency. You and I spoke a little bit about that just when we met this morning. I have been sharing this message consistently. I mean, literally 365 days a year for 6 years. I don't ever stop, ever, right? So that helps, right? That helps because people need to hear messages repeatedly, which is why I always say to people that are a little bit newer on this journey of say, thought leadership, don't give up. Because there are many days when what you believe in, nobody else cares about, right? You know, hundreds of days where I would get up and think, does anyone care about me talking about empathy at work? And being pretty sure that the answer is no. That is now changing. And of course, my voice is not by any means the leading or lone voice in this field, right? But the consistency was very important. The data is very important. I mean, I could spend the next hour, Marcus, telling you data around the workplace, whether that is 21% higher profits in organizations that have higher levels of empathy, 68% higher levels of engagement, 48% higher levels of innovation. I could carry on, 35% higher levels of output. There's endless data. So that helps. But I think also this narrative around this is not a soft skill. This is a hard skill, right? It's hard to find. It's hard to master. And it's very hard to maintain. But when you have it in place, you have hard business results. So this is not like, I don't know, it really truly is not optional. Either you understand your people and you're able to motivate them, retain them, and get them to work together, or you can't. And, you know, in the end, our businesses are made up of people. Will your business survive? Probably, but will the competition run faster? Perhaps, right? So, you know, I think that's the thing. I always talk about 3 stages of change, really. First of all, there's awareness, which is what you and I are doing today. So thank you, right? Having conversations, being on stages, writing books, all of that stuff. The second stage is intention. And that has to come down to the leader themselves, or in your personal life, you yourself as a husband, wife, brother, sister, whoever you are, right? You have to intentionally listen, right? If I want to understand you, the backbone to all empathy is listening. I have to intentionally listen, right? And then the third step is accountability or measurement. Because what we measure manifests. So if you want your workplace to be more empathetic, and by saying that I mean more connected, listening to each other, working together, you have to put KPIs in place to do it. Because humans need measurement, they need consistency, they need rules, they need a vision. It's how we grow. So if you want that more pro-group behavior, you have to measure people on it. You have to give them accountability for that.
Okay. So I'm going to steal something shamelessly from you. You talked about it's not a soft skill, it's a hard skill because it's hard to find and it's hard to develop. So I love that. Yeah. I'm absolutely going to use that. Okay. So when you're talking to these leaders, I understand that you have something that you call listening-led leadership. So tell me a little bit more about that. I'm assuming it has something to do with active listening.
Yes, it does. And actually, I created that term a few years ago in empathy for my audiences, because what I knew then and know now is that for most people, they don't know what empathy is. They do think it's a soft skill because we have like 40 years of conditioning, and therefore it holds low value to most leaders, right? When it comes to time in our lives, which is a very depleted resource, we put time where we place value. Mm-hmm. So if I needed more people to listen to this message, and when I say I needed, the world needs, right? We need our organizations to have these conversations. I knew that I had to find a way that involved not talking about empathy, because less so today, but particularly 4 or 5 years ago, if I stood up in an auditorium or an event with 3,000 predominantly men in suits in Mumbai, India, right? And I stood up there with my blonde hair and started saying, so we're going to talk about empathy. I'm going to lose them, right? Yeah. They're not interested in empathy. They think it's sympathy or compassion or being kind or something. So what I knew then, and obviously teach now, is that the core to all empathy is listening, curiosity. Mm. We need our leaders to listen to the people they lead, to listen more than they speak. So listening-led leadership is fundamentally the way I teach how to be empathetic in life, in leadership. How do we teach more people to be able to listen first and to use that ability to listen first to transform their lives and their organizations? In the workplace, I know this to be true because of all the data I have, because of all the work and the clients I work with. In my personal life, I know it to be true because my life has changed when I do it, right? So when I started this work, I think I had about 300 people on my LinkedIn. And last year we reached 5 million, and we don't spend any money on advertising. So the only, like my data set around why listening first will change your life is because when I do it, my life changed, or when I do it, my life continues to change. So that's what listening-led leadership is all about. It's about listening first and being able to build relationships and understanding of the humans that you work and live with.
Wow, 5 million. That's impressive. I think I'm up to 5,000 on LinkedIn, so I'm on your tails.
Yes, you're there. Honestly, it's amazing to me too. When the guys, my team, showed me that data in early December, a few months ago. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really a data person. I don't really care, to be honest, most of the time. But yes, that was a really amazing moment because it just means that public psyche is changing.
Yeah, I like that.
I didn't change. I did exactly the same thing that I'd done for years. But suddenly people like you find me and are interested and say, maybe she's on to something. Like maybe we should be understanding each other better. And let's have a conversation about that.
Yeah. Well, it's hugely motivating for someone like myself who has been talking about hope for a while and sometimes feels like, nobody's listening. So I'm glad to hear that people are.
They are.
We haven't talked yet. We're like 25 minutes into this conversation. This is the world record for me, and I haven't brought up AI. I mean, I kind of did at the beginning when I mentioned.
You started there.
So now that it's such a prominent topic, right? And it's changing everything. We know that. My question for you, Mimi, is how is AI changing the importance of empathy? Is it making it more important, less important? I mean, I'm reading recently about their mental health is a problem, right? Mental health practitioners, there's a shortage. So they've created these chatbots where you, as a patient, can go talk to AI instead of a human. And in some cases, they're saying people are like more forthcoming with the chatbot because I know it's not a real person, so I'm going to tell it everything.
Yes.
And so it's like actually kind of effective. So what do you think? Is AI going to make empathy more or less important, or what's your point of view?
Look, I have two sort of thoughts on that, Marcus. The first thing I would say is that people say that AI has no empathy or that it's fake in some way. And that I disagree with, right? I think the ability to show empathy, because it's a skill set, AI can definitely do it. I know because I practice with it, right? When I use ChatGPT. When I speak to ChatGPT about challenges or problems that's going on, and I say, I had this conversation with Marcus and he's asked me this thing and I don't know the answer, it can understand me, right? Is that the same as human empathy? No. But there is empathy in the world of AI. And because it learns from us, it is learning it all the time. Now, we spoke earlier about the empathy deficit. What I didn't tell you is that over the last 30 years, we have lost 48% of our empathy. So that's nearly 50% of a skill set that keeps us alive. And we've lost nearly 50% of it over 30 years. And we're very bad at filling that gap. We've done very little to fix it. So my second opinion is that if AI can mimic empathy at scale in an area where we are failing so badly, then please go ahead, right? Again, is it the same as being with a human? No. And let me give you an example. Certainly in the East, we have a lot of shops now and restaurants too, where there are robots who run the shop. I went for lunch the other day in a Thai restaurant and there are no waitresses and waiters. And this is not like a posh restaurant. It's like in a mall, like
wow.
average Thai restaurant, right? And what's amazing is because the little robots want you to hear them, they play hit songs when they come to your table. It's epic. So you're like eating your food and then you'll hear like Golden come on and you look and there's a robot with your rice. Anyway, my point is those robots, obviously their welcome message and stuff, it's all pre-programmed. So If you come into the restaurant really happy and it says, "Hello, welcome to my restaurant," you're like, "Hey, good morning." But if you came in floods of tears and grief, it's still going to say, "Hello, welcome to our." So, of course, the machine, the AI tuned anything, cannot respond in the same way as we can, right? As we as humans, we have a very innate connection as living human beings, right? There's energetic exchange. There's that kind of intangibility of a feeling when I'm like, I think Marcus is not feeling well today. I can't tell you why. I just have a sense, right? Because I know him.
Yeah.
So AI cannot, at least for the foreseeable future, do that. It is not a human, right? But can it mimic it? Yes. And in my belief, we should encourage it in many ways. And I know why there's so much fear. I do understand that. But I feel that a lot of that fear is coming from a very Western-centric reality. And let me just explain myself there. In that, in the east of the world, and in fact, pretty much everywhere, so the billions of people that are not living in developed Western societies, for many of those people, they are never going to hear the word coach, right? No one's ever going to send them to a counselor or a psychologist or a life coach. That is not an accessible service to the majority of the world. So if you had a young woman, let's say in a Kenyan rural village, and this young woman is extremely smart and she wants to be a doctor, but her parents are farm workers and everybody she knows is a farm worker because she grew up in a farm area. So when she asks those people or the teachers at school, how do I become a doctor? They don't know. They're like, oh, I don't know really, but I can tell you how to farm. And then that young lady's kind of stuck. However, if she can go onto her phone and ask ChatGPT or some other similar platform, I live in this village, my parents want me to be a farmer, but I really want to be a doctor. As a young woman, can I do that, ChatGPT? And if ChatGPT writes back and says, do you know what, you should dream. And the great news is that 3 hours away on the bus, there's actually a scholarship for medical school. Now, this young woman doesn't even know where that 3 hours on the bus goes. So that's why I say, Marcus, I think it's quite a one-dimensional message. There are so many pockets of our earth that could be benefiting from artificial empathy versus no empathy, right? So it's a nuanced reality. I understand that. But my opinion, and I know it's not liked by everybody, is that empathy can be replicated in an AI environment and often to a lot of good. The medical system would be another example, right? You call the hospital in the middle of the night and you're able to speak to a bot that does really empathize with you and says, Mummy, I know your daughter's 2 years old. I know this is happening to you, but this is what the evidence says. This is what you should do. Is far better, than perhaps being on a call center to a human who just doesn't care and gives you nothing. So, as I said, very nuanced, but I believe that there is a place for empathy in AI and that we should embrace it.
That is not what I expected you to say, I have to admit.
I like to surprise you.
Wow. So interesting, though. I mean, if you follow that down the logical path, then what that means to me, I'm a recovering HR practitioner myself, and I get a lot of, the more tenured HR folks that are like, I don't like all of this chatbot stuff and pushing people to technology. It feels impersonal. That's not why we're here. But it sounds like it actually can work somewhat well. There's the intangibles, as you pointed out, that you cannot fabricate through technology, because the technology doesn't have that lived experience, but it can learn through everyone else's experience and provide a pretty accurate point of view. And so that was really fascinating. Okay, we're coming up on probably the time that we have. Let me ask one last question. For those folks that are like, okay, this whole concept of empathy is kind of new to me, but now I'm convinced that I need it. And it's a skill, it's a muscle. How do I do some exercises tomorrow to work that muscle? What can I start doing in terms of habits that I can start practicing to become more empathetic in the future?
So The steps to become more empathetic are, it's good news, are small and simple on the whole. They're not always easy, right? They take practice like any skill set. But to be empathetic is a choice in life. You know, it's a skill that you choose to use, right? So I didn't say this earlier, but you are born with this. So just for anyone listening who thinks, oh, but I'm not very empathetic, or my husband is more empathetic than me, you're all exactly the same. We all have the same amount of empathy. It's built into the brain. You were born with it. So the ability to use it is just a choice. So if I were to give you 3 really simple steps, they all come back to listening in some format, really, for the sake of ease. The first thing I would say is to use people's names more often. Our names are sort of the first gift we were ever given when we were born. And neurologically, people respond, and psychologically, really differently to their name. So the first micro tip I would give your audience is try using people's names more often and just see what happens. Right? When you go to the coffee shop tomorrow morning and order your coffee, and the person probably has a name tag, they often do in hospitality. And when that person says, looks up and says, what do you want? And you say, Marcus, can I please have a latte? You will see them shift, right? So that's really easy. Do it with your kids. Do it with their teachers. I mean, last night I picked my daughter up from school. The teacher came out to greet me to give some homework. And, as soon as I really smile and say his name, he's with me, right? Because probably no one has said his name except the kids all day, So the first one is to use people's names. The second one I would say is eye contact. It's, again, probably simple, but not always that easy. We're very conditioned to look at our phone screens today. We're very distractible by a million things. But to make eye contact is, again, an evolutionary ability to create connection. And my tip there is that if you struggle with this, try to remember somebody's eye color. Because in the split second, right, that I look at you and I say, what color are his eyes, right? The person doesn't know you're thinking that. But in that split second, you have created a really human connection. And subconsciously, that shifts, relationships. And then the third thing I would do is really ask yourself, am I listening to reply, or am I listening to understand? And most of the time, in most meetings around the world, we are listening to reply.
Yeah.
You are waiting for your opportunity to give your opinion. You are waiting to jump in and say, no, but Marcus, that can't work because the timings are going to change. And I spoke to my boss and all those things, right? Versus really listening to understand what Marcus is saying. And then later you can work on your response. So that simple question, again, in parenting as well. If you're listening and you have kids around you, practice with them, and you will find nearly always, especially with young children, you're just waiting to tell them what you think. No, you can't have ice cream for breakfast, or no, you can't go to the park now, or whatever it is you want to tell them, versus actually listening to understand what they're trying to tell you. And it would be the same in the workplace. So there we go. So using people's names, making eye contact, and really listening to understand versus reply.
Love that. Very pragmatic suggestions. I like that. They're not super difficult.
Good.
My wife and I actually have done that before too. We'll be like, what color was that person's eyes? Because that shows that you were really paying attention. So I like that little tip.
Yeah. Awesome.
Okay. So I guess last thing for you, you've got a book coming out, right? Is that the connection prescription, or is it you have so many books I can't keep track of them all?
I also can't keep track of them, Marcus. I just love writing books, and suddenly there seems to be so many, and they're all coming together. But yes, the connection prescription comes out on the 12th of May in New York City, which I'm very excited about. That book really talks a lot about what we're speaking about today, but also a lot about longevity, why it is that we need empathy and belonging to survive fundamentally as human beings in our relationships, but also in our leadership and our life. But I also have a really easy handbook coming out called 40 Ways to Connect with People, which is lots of things that I just said. So 40 small tips that allow people to just flick through that book at any time and say, what can I do today to connect better with the people around me? So it's less of a leadership book and more of kind of a self-help guide that just gives people 40 really quick, easy, simple, 20-word ways to be more connected in their lives. So both of those come out in the next 4 months.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to picking those up. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Hope at Work podcast. Really motivating to see someone like yourself who has kept at it, as you suggested, and kept talking about empathy, whether people were listening or not. And now I'm glad that a lot of people seem to be listening. So thank you again for taking the time to join the show.
Well, thank you for listening to me. Thank you for having me.
You bet.